Hello, very beautiful community. Let me quickly know if you can see and hear me. Had a challenging health weekend. Sending you all my love if you're having a good weekend or a mixed weekend or a difficult weekend. But I thought I'd come through and answer a few personal questions about your challenges, your struggles, if you are feeling like asking some. So we've got quite a few questions I can see already. And what I'm going to do is just cut and paste them so that I can answer them as we go, but also keep connected with what we're doing live. So there we go. Beautiful community. Malfitano, you've also had a really difficult weekend physically. So thank you so much for being with us and facilitating us. All right, let's just dip in and out. Hey, Vlad, Toby, what are your thoughts on applying stoic philosophy? I find principles like the dichotomy of control helpful, but also wonder whether taken too far, they can lead to an unhealthy relationship with emotions. So, this is an actual tradition of thought in the West, which automatically means that 99% of Instagram posts about it are going to misrepresent it. When you look at the tradition itself, there is an enormous amount you can indeed take from it. But the central problem with the tradition is that it struggles to identify what it means to lead a good life, irrespective of the good life leading options available to you. What you don't want is a view of the goods available to you in life that is dependent on whether you can access them, right? Because it might be that something is a very important good for you, but you can't access it. You can then get into all sorts of trouble by trying to repress the sense of loss about it. You might experience what my philosophical hero Bernard Williams used to call the loss of the sense of loss, which is another very important loss, that you are so evasive about dancing with what is unavailable to you in life that you have pretended that you never wanted it in the first place. So that's a very central problem for this tradition. It really struggles to identify what is a good life, irrespective of what is available to you, which risks, especially when it's convened via short Instagram posts, sort of leading you to a glib evasion of a commercial kind of the tragic dimensions of life. I'll do a video, I'm sure, in depth on Stoicism and maybe Stoicism as self-help on the philosophy channel. Giovanni, no thoughts on Italian politics. I'm so sorry to say today because we're taking personal questions. Let's have a look. J.G. Leon Zambrano. Hey, Vlad. Thanks for the chats. What's the difference between a dream or goal that's a hold up versus one that's just incredibly and increasingly more difficult to achieve? So, one of the top 3 to 5 things I deal with in my consulting is a situation whereby a talented professional's aspirations, creative aspirations, for instance, have become such a weight that they are acting to decrease the chances that that person is actually going to move toward them. So there are all kinds of ways of holding your destination in life that are actually oppressive, that are actually going to prevent you from getting there. because the weight is too heavy. You're going to spend too much of your time just holding it, because your sense of this object where you're going to arrive is unrealistic. It's too predetermined. It's not open to the possibility of being surprised, right? Imagine being an 18-year-old football player who's clearly going to be good enough to play. I'm giving an extreme World Cup related example, who's clearly going to be good enough to play in the top or second to top division in Spain, France, Germany, Italy, or England. But you have this clear idea of where you want to be by 27. By 27, I want to operate like this in my position, which is the left wing. I want to be able to pass like that. I want to be able to have vision over the pitch of this kind, perhaps the kind that these two people I admire have. And so what are you going to do? You're going to start putting artificial objects into yourself instead of dealing with objects that have the kind of open-endedness and plasticity that real aspirations have. The truth is, I'm going to develop, and I'm not going to know what kind of football player I'm going to be at 27 if it all goes well, because partly it's going to be a product of my development that I can't anticipate. I can predict it. I mean, I know I'm not going to be a center back, but what if I begin to shift from being a wide player to a cam, a central attacking midfielder? That's possible. What if I start playing up front? What if somehow I get cultivated in virtue of the overlap between my skills and the system that a coach I work with plays into being a wing back? You don't know, right? And what's going to happen is that you're going to oppress your development by painting an overly determined object of where you want to land. It is never going to look like that, right? I have some very clear picture of where I would be philosophically, professionally, what 2 books I would have published by now if I were not sick. And I'm 45. But if you take away my sickness, exactly what my contribution to philosophy would not be identical to some kind of mold that I'm addicted to. It would partly be a surprise. Yeah, I can see that that's how it turned out. I understand. And that I really could predict, and also this. But in other ways, it was a surprise. It's still me, it's still my talents as they develop, but it's a surprise, right? So there's such a way of holding your future aspirations that they, in fact, are just a neurotic way of obstructing you from moving there. And because it feels like such an idealized and unreal object and such a heavy object, every time you turn to it, you're inclined to procrastinate, or inclined to waste your time, or inclined to play some kind of computer game you play instead of moving toward it, because it doesn't feel like a real thing. And almost on a bodily level, your body's going to tell you, well, why the hell do you expect me to invest hours and effort into moving towards something that I don't quite recognize as real? Right? So this is very, 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 very important. A certain kind of idealization of your destination for the realization of your talent that in fact oppresses you and stops you from moving forward with your talent. Ooh, borderline off topic. I'm going to try it. Invisible poor. Hey, Vlad, how good a proxy for national identity is genuine support for its national football team? I seem to see a lot of integrated immigrants supporting their country of origin. So let's answer it more from a first personal development point of view. Yeah, I do think you need to ask yourself some questions. If you live in France and you were born in France, but you have no inclination to support French sport compared with the sport of the country your parents came from, I think that's worth thinking about. Sure. It doesn't need to be fixed. You can support maybe both, but I would say that a complete absence of interest is a little bit of a problem for solidarity. how you going to be in the same community as everybody around you, right? If you just support the country you exited from, right? So it's incredibly important in our politics that we care about as much of the rest of the world as possible. But it's also important that we care, politically at least, about the rest of the world, partly through the prism of being part of the community that we are part of, together with all the other citizens of our country. I don't actually like it when completely legitimate outrage about Gaza begins to sound like you're basically preoccupied with a foreign place that's going to leave Britain essentially secondary. No, your concern about the catastrophe of what happened there should be in good part inflected through your membership of this political community, right? So that's my sort of the beginning of an answer there. Anna, love your work. Thank you so much. Paul grew up very insecure dating wise, had a glow up and became conventionally attractive at uni, and then had a sort of promiscuous phase. And I feel like that's ruined my ability for quality relationships. Now, I just saw a question that was very similar. So let me see if I can pair them together. Oh, yeah, let me try. Invisible Poor, right. Self-development question. As a mid-20s man, I'm anxious about big steps in relationships, moving together, marriage, kids. I feel like it means a part of me has to die. How do I move forward with that? I'll try to take Pool and Invisible Poor, your questions a little bit together. So what you want, and this is easier said than done. Most people can't do this, and very few people do this well. What you want is, rather than being engulfed by your relationship, by your marriage, by your family, you want to be expanded by them. So that it's not a threat, but an expansion of your being in the world. That means you have to deal with certain ideas like dependence on the ultimate reality of other human beings who you can't control. It also means that you have to deal with non-pathologically with the non-accumulative relationship we have with romantic love. I have some close friends. If another close friend appeared in my life, for health reasons, I might not have the time for that. I don't have the time for any of my close friends, in fact. But virtually for none, except one. But there'd been a conflict between a new friend that comes along and the close friends I already have. I could just add them. They're relationships of accumulation. I seem to have frozen for some reason. They're relationships of accumulation, whereas romantic relationships are relationships of substitution. There is always the question available, what if something else instead of this? So I'm just going to try to appear myself. Let me see if I can do this. I think I have reappeared. So they are relationships of substitution, romantic relationships. And romantic relationships both bring the best out of us, but they also maximize all of our pathology. So whatever is wrong with you is going to maximally come out in your romantic relationship much more than in your friendship. For Paul, obviously, not relying on desirability as a kind of self-rescue is very, very important, right? But that means being able to enter a relationship with a sense of give and take and a sense of openness. Openness to being frustrated, openness to being surprised, openness to growth and transformation. Even though in our culture we are increasingly moving toward either a kind of corrosive reversal into slightly fascistized re-emphasis of traditional roles on the one hand, or on the other hand towards excessive indulgence of increasingly particular relational practices like polyamory. In fact, a lifelong conversation, a very, very long conversation with a partner, conversation during which both of you change a great deal, is very exciting. It's a very exciting journey. It's not a journey you can replicate by having a consecutive sort of pile of 3-year relationships. It's very, very exciting. It's a very exciting conversation with which you can play, with which you can have a lot of fun. It's in fact one of the most exciting things you can try to do. Our culture is very inarticulate about how exciting it is, but it is very exciting, and you don't need to justify it with all of the sort of pseudo-conservative blurbification that often comes from, well, the traditional family is needed for that. So, no, a committed couple relationship that lasts until one of the people in the relationship dies is an incredibly exciting thing. And when it goes well, it expands you, right? Rather than engulfs you. Because if it's engulfing you, either it's the wrong relationship or you need to do therapy. I haven't done justice to your questions, and I'm sorry, but this is just a couple of cents that I can throw out. Hey, Vlad, Gara is asking, I have 2 questions. What's the lesson from Sam Harris's line about the scars of autodidacticism? I don't know what Sam's talking about there. Do you mean people who are self-taught? They're huge, the problems. I mean, the result in people like Brett Weinstein thinking they're an expert on public health, or Brett Weinstein thinking that they're an expert on politics or matters of cultural moment that come and go, right? He thought he could explain World War II via evolutionary biology. So there are humans who can teach themselves stuff alone. They are few. They are few, right? I'm one. It's rare. It's not 1 in 1,000. It's way more rare. So the idea that you can become a real expert on something alone is requiring a really weird psychology. Could be an unhealthy psychology, actually, in some respects, something you don't want. So that's why at a societal level, the environments that promote truth best are not the free exchange of ideas and the marketplace of ideas. They are highly coercive, institutionalized contexts, like a scientific research paper, peer-reviewed, Doesn't mean you can't have that process corrupted. Of course you can, but it, at least in principle, can get you a certain kind of truth-oriented directionality. A philosophy seminar, right, where there's a lot of coercive mechanisms, right? And if that goes well, that is actually an environment where somebody can say, well, I'll give you an example. A prominent political philosopher who's nice, I won't name them because this example could sound slightly mean. This was in my last few months before my illness, when I was very quick, which is not that great a virtue. And this wonderful professor of philosophy at Oxford said, I've been thinking about this for 30 years, and this is what I think about it. And I said, no, you don't. And no, it isn't. And he said, actually, no, I don't, and no, it isn't. It is only in an extremely coercive institutional environment in which human beings can be facilitated to engage in that extraordinary interaction. I invite you to cultivate that way of interacting in your lives. But it requires enormous institutional coerciveness. It's a very special kind of ritual with very, very particular kinds of rules, right? Now, as I just implied, somewhat egomaniacally, I am probably biographically a bit of a freak in that sense, that even without being institutionally nudged, I can wake up and be told, Vlad, you know how you've been thinking this for 10 years? You're wrong. And I can say, you know what? I'm completely wrong. I've been thinking this for 10 years and I'm completely wrong. And I dedicated my life to this and I'm completely wrong. This is almost sick. This is almost weird. It's not healthy, because what suddenly you're doing, you're taking a very high degree of engagement with something, just ripping it out. And for that, you need various kinds of professional virtues for that not to feel like a sort of operation without an aesthetic. And so what I'm saying is that the chances that you're going to sit at home and without any interaction cultivate your skills in a particular domain, like, for instance, philosophy, the chances of that are very narrow. Now, what you could do is then you can begin to blur the ground here. You could begin to say, well, what does interaction mean? Does it have to be interacting in person? Or could I start sort of sitting in by Zoom on some, I don't know, postgrad lectures in philosophy? Could I consume some YouTube videos? Could I begin to build myself up without back and forth exchange? Yeah, that is going to be better than you going on a walk, as a lot of people do, by the way. A lot of professional scientists do this, by the way, in their personal life. They go on a walk, they haven't read more than 4 philosophy books in their life, and they begin to have philosophical thought, and they do that every Sunday morning for an hour. And they think they're a philosopher, and they haven't read any philosophy. They have no kind of scaffolding to orient themselves. But because they know that they're extremely intelligent and they're highly successful in their field, they have these philosophical thoughts. And what they effectively are the village philosopher. They are, if you like, the most knowledgeable and informed and imaginative person of the people who don't know what they're talking about. And there's grave risk of this. You often see this manifesting in transference of expertise, right? So if I started talking about a field that had nothing to do with ethics or politics, that might happen to me. It often happens when philosophers, for instance, talk about music. It can sound absolutely dreadful. They begin to impose theories that are just not going to be consistent with what a good intuitive musician is experiencing when they react to the piece, right? So it's very, very, very difficult to teach yourself something alone. And here is another problem. If you are an exceptionally intelligent person and you go on your Sunday morning walk and you think about, let's say, ethics, but you haven't read any Kant or Hume or Aristotle, what's going to be happening in your mind? What's going to be essentially happening in your mind is that you're going to have remnants of Kant and Aristotle and Hume coming through your mind because they're parts of our culture without even recognizing them. So you're just going to have fragments of Kant speaking through you without being able to even recognize any of them. Right? And that's that's an embarrassing village philosopher kind of feel. So you've got to be, I might have completely misunderstood your question, but you've got to be very, very careful about teaching yourself something. It's not undoable, but the assumption is that most of the time, most people are not going to be able to do it. You need back and forth exchange. You need interaction. You might make a lot of progress without literally direct in-person interaction, but you need some kind of interaction. There genuinely are people in this world who think they can discover important philosophical truths by thinking about them without reading any philosophy. And that's just not possible, except if you are a very, 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 very freakish sort of historical genius. So, right, I could never do that. I couldn't even come close to being able to do that. So don't confuse that with the previous point I said about what I could do, which is, as it were, preserve a capacity to think for myself and remain engaged and open without that institutional setting. That's not the same as saying that I could do this latter thing I've mentioned. I absolutely couldn't. Okay, let's just scroll more to the live. I can see more questions that were left behind. Let's scroll more to where we are in the live. Alexander is asking, this isn't personal development enough. And so let's try it. In your video yesterday, you spoke to a question, how do you know Nigel Farage will be anti-constitutional? By which I just mean he doesn't give a hoot about institutions and checking power to keep our democracy on the road. How do you know that he'll be anti-constitutional as he is not yet in power? How do you approach this type of objection in a general sense? So my advice is to not try to pretend that there's a mode of technical expertise about this that doesn't exist. So don't bullshit about that. There's nothing demonstrable you can do here. There is nothing technical. There is no, I've read 74 psychology papers and here is the answer. This has to be about pattern recognition. Neurodiverse people are sometimes better, well, tendentiously better than neurotypical people at that. And it's also about emotional intelligence. It's on a continuum with the same thing as if you walked into a room and I'd be able to tell if you're having a good day or a bad day. And I'd be able to tell if you're happy or unhappy in your life. And I'd be able to tell if you're confident or unconfident. Vlad, how do you know? And I'd be able to tell roughly if you're going to be really committed to your partner, or if you're going to cheat on them. Vlad, how can you tell that by looking at someone for 10 minutes? Well, you can't, for sure, but very often you'll know. And that kind of knowledge is knowledge that sits in between the factual and the empirical and the subjective. And it's into these that we try to sort of divide our world, such that most people think, well, for now, this is a little bit of sort of heebie-jeebie intuition, but eventually we'll be able to clarify it into a system of making sense of the world that's a little bit more transparent and perhaps analytically clear. No, no, no. This is not something that can be systematized. This is about how embodied human beings living purposive lives and negotiating a complex map of a social and psychological world go about reading that, all of that. So don't do any scientific bullshit here. Just say, I can just, what is the most sort of everyday, banal reduction of what I've said that still works? I don't trust Nigel. I look at Nigel and I wouldn't trust him. Point one. Point two, when Nigel comes to power, I know a little bit about how institutions work and how and how incentives work. And I know how these incentives will interact with this quality of Nigel, which is to do with how I don't trust him. Right? What if somebody comes along and says, well, you really don't trust Nigel, but I do. He's the realest politician in the country. Otherwise, he wouldn't be ahead in the polls. What do you do with that? Well, what you do is point out that one person's insight, one person's intuition will be superior here. And a typical manifestation of that is that one person will see the other person's perspective and their own, whereas the other person's perspective will be the only thing they see. So if you are in the superior position here, you will have two. The other person will have one. They'll have just their own view. You'll have their view and your view, and therefore capacity to distinguish between the two views and see that one is superior. So you can't do it. You can't take the mooch and say, hey, mooch, you're really intuitive about Trump. Let's systematize it and put it into some kind of papers that theorize your knowledge. No, it's not theorizable knowledge. Fyodor, I don't know. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm sorry. You've hit a spot of ignorance for me. Shipianka, I mean, a lot of philosophers got the axioms of reality wrong. So how come their conclusions can amount to anything if they start from the wrong assumptions? That's why I prefer hard scientists talking about philosophy. Hard scientists can't talk about philosophy. Hard scientists don't know anything about philosophy. Hard scientists can't ask philosophical questions because they don't know if they're going to be asking the right question or not. How do they know? When I get questions like, hey, Vlad, this is my view of free will. What do you reckon? Hey, Vlad, this is my view about whether human perspective represents reality. Ever. Does it in physics? Does it in anything? Oh, hey, Vlad, this is my view about what consciousness is, right? Or Vlad, hey, this is my view about what intention is. Most of the time, what will be wrong with where you're coming from is not your answer, but your question. And when you speak to a good philosopher about your question, what will dissolve is not your sense of your answer, but your sense of your question, right? So it's not possible for a hard scientist who's not a philosopher to do any philosophy. They're not going to know even how to identify the questions that matter. They're not going to know what possible answers there are to these questions. Right? It's literally impossible. It's not that you prefer. So what you've said is literally like, it's like saying that you prefer figure skaters playing the piano. Nobody will come and arrest you for that, but it's obviously not an ideal preference. And the other way around, you don't want philosophers talking about hard science unless it's about that meeting point, which is very important and increasingly rich, where it's not clear what one is, where there's certain bits of theoretical overlap between philosophy of science and various kinds of scientific thought, and there is indeed a gray area, but that's the exception. NAPZ, hey, I wonder about relying on a mix of Zizek, Peterson, Christian individualist thought, Buddhism, and so on. What do you think? I'm going to give a weird answer. It matters less what you rely on and matters more how you engage with it. I mean, somebody could get more out of this thermos than somebody else might get out of the various Buddhist traditions. Somebody could get more out of just sitting there staring at that thermos. So it's how you engage. And the most important thing is that you are able to think for yourself. Not think originally, but think for yourself. That you're able to sit there and ask questions about questions. And protect your thought from being borrowed, right? Protect your thought from being entirely a reconstruction, not just of the thoughts of others, but of the phrases, the particular phrases that express the thoughts of others, right? If you put all of my YouTube correspondence that I get into AI, it's shocking how much the same phrases will keep recurring. That will indicate that people are not thinking for themselves. They've just incorporated something. And that, here is me putting it in. So it's very important that you think for yourself. And somebody who engages in this kind of thoughtless and self-indulgent way with a great philosopher is going to be still in a worse place than somebody who engages in this proper and open-minded way with a crappy philosopher, right? So that's the answer. It matters more how you do it than what it is you're engaging with. Because if you engage well, you'll eventually move forward and beyond the things that you started with. RRJ, I might not be able to answer your question. Let's give it a whirl. Hey, Vlad, I'm 29 and I'm in a standstill since 18. 4 failed university attempts. Can't start or stick with anything. Waiting for a therapist. I vaguely want to be an artist, but have zero clue how to begin anything. Well, on being an artist, or at least on being somebody who does something crafty or creative, do a lot for 6 months and then reassess. And if it looks like it doesn't work, do a lot of something else again for 6 months and then reassess. On waiting for a therapist, it might be difficult to get a therapist. It might be financially difficult. It might be that you need to be in some kind of queue or assessment or referral process. But eventually you've got to get one. And if you don't like them, you don't get on with them, get a second one. Obviously, for goodness sake, find out whether you're neurodiverse or not, because if you are, that could explain partly why you did the 4 failed university attempts. I can't substantively answer you because I don't know what is stopping you, what's going on with you pathologically. What I would say is that one of the things that's missing in our culture is how inspiring it is to work on yourself and make progress. We're still a victim culture in many ways. The problem is it's often people on the alt-right who say that, and people who are committed to inclusion and structural disadvantage like me sometimes don't say that. No, but we're a victim culture in many ways. It's not that we need to stop helping people who are disadvantaged. We need to help them more. That's not the point. But the point is that, among other things, what's missing is the sense of being inspired by making progress and holding oneself responsible to making progress, which doesn't mean I've got to make this much progress every 3 months. It means that you are improvisatorily committed to your own self-development. You take pride in it. Wow, I'm 29, but I'm 12 years old. When I'm 32, I'm going to be 14, and I'm proud of that. Hi, I'm seeing you. You're my friend. I'm now 32, and I'm 14. And when I'm 36, I'm going to be 18. And I feel it. I'm going to get there. So this should be a source of pride. And a lot of where the pride comes from is that you're trying to do something you don't know how to do, and it's difficult. So recognizing that difficulty, taking pride that you're doing something difficult and uncertain is very, very beautiful. It's very, very moving and highly inspirational, especially in our culture, which is going to tend to push you toward identifying with what is wrong with you, rather than actually taking responsibility for it and being inspired by the idea of being freer. Hey, Vlad, I'm 35-year-old from Cornwall. By the way, Cornwall is my favorite part of the country. Senan is my favorite part of the country. It's the only part of England. It's the most extreme southwestern part of the country. It's the only part of England that feels raw. I can't go there for health reasons now, but it has an incredible raw beauty. It almost feels like Greece. And one of the strange things about the UK is how manicured much of it is. Okay, I'm an aspiring writer and I'm training to be an ecologist. I have found that I'm embarrassed to make content like yourself with myself in it. Any advice? Sure. You've got to decide if you need to do it. It might be that like posting on LinkedIn and developing your career, blah, 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 would be enough. If you decide that this is right for you, it needs to not feel completely unenjoyable and shit. Because if it feels completely unenjoyable and shit because you're too much of an introvert or something else, it's just not good. The next thing you've got to do is figure out what medium is right for you. Unfortunately, there's a prejudice in our culture, and that is that video is algorithmically superior to audio. In other words, if you want to grow an audio podcast or an audio platform, you've got to also probably have a video component, unless you're somehow doing it super professionally or you're already established. But it still means you do have to eventually aspire to land on the way of doing it that works best for you. And that might be audio, it might be video, it might be video without you in it. Absolutely possible on this platform. But you're going to discover what's good for you. What else I'd say here is that most people simply get to a minimum level of adequacy with it. There are some people who are really good, really special communicators, but there are also people who just do it long enough and they get there. It takes probably a year or two of practicing to be comfortable with it. So, for instance, before I did YouTube, I was very comfortable with public speaking. I did a lot of public speaking. But I realized that speaking in public is completely different to having a little smartphone camera shoved in your face, which is sitting in my bed, which is what I've got right now. So it also just takes practice. And then, please, for the life of Christ, if you get into it, do not get algorithmically lost. There are going to be a lot of pressures for you to get algorithmically lost. Please don't do it. Right? Don't be the ecologist who drifts towards being, more reassuring about, all the worrying things that your subject tells us, because algorithms push you in that direction. Right? Or don't be one who catastrophizes even beyond the catastrophe we're facing, because algorithms tell you to do that. Don't do that. But the biggest piece of advice I would say is, if this is an important part of your career, which it might well not be, begin. And as you begin, watch others who you think are doing things in the way you like and pick up tips from them. So this is actually the biggest tip I'm going to give you with social media. Professionalize your consumption of it. Right? Most people consume social media. Okay, it's another cat, for piglets, another cat. A professional consumption is, okay, even if this is a cat, this is an interesting way of introducing a cat. Could I introduce an ecological idea in the same way, right? So you consume content professionally. So consume 30 minutes of content professionally a week. And make some mental notes about it. And that'll build up a sense inside you of what works, what's possible, and how to do this. All right. Not Magenta is saying it's a matter of perspective in response to Jan. We laud ancient philosophers, but there's a lot wrong in them. Well, it's very important. There is no problem with being great and wrong. You don't become any less great in virtue of being wrong, because one way of being great in philosophy is to make the deepest errors. Vlad, how do I get over a bad burnout? My relationship with drawing has been up and down since, and it's been 2.5 years now. Do not have any unintentional contact with the thing you love. Right? Think of it like sex, right? Western civilization is full of unintentional sex. Don't do it or be present. Be fully present or don't do it. So don't do it unless you're fully present. So step away unless you can be fully present. And having stepped away, because it doesn't sound like you've yet stepped away, you've been for 2.5 years. You step away, right? And then you're going to have to make a very clear discovery at some point, which is this really going to be part of your life or is it not? And you're going to have to wait for your experience to tell you what the answer is to that. Second tip, create the best possible environment for you to draw. create the most ideal possible environment. This can also get pathological, right? There are people who say, you know, yes, I'm a painter, but to paint, I need to be in that place, and I need to have that gear, and I need to be in that mood, and the sky needs to be like that, and I need to have had that much time off the other projects I'm doing, and by the time they've qualified it all, it's sort of like threading something through a needle. But because you've run dry like this, it's very important to create some artificial conditions, artificially conducive conditions that are spectacularly conducive, right? And see what happens as a result of that. Is there some kind of organic pool that then develops that brings you back to it in a good way? I mean, then third, obviously, look at all the kinds of insecurity and negative self-talk and ambition as a weight that actually stops you from moving toward your ambitions, kind of problems that you might have. So it also, of course, requires some psychological understanding of why you are stuck like that. Callum, thank you so much for being so nice about me. Daniel, I'm 23, American. I'm a filmmaker. Sometimes I wonder if we could see a significant or at least an exciting art movement from these conditions. What does our particular crisis mean for creativity? Well, this is an age-old debate in the history of the West of whether deleterious political conditions are actually more conducive to art production and creativity or not. I tend to be someone who thinks that the pool of talent you've got is the pool of talent you've got, and that people often come through despite all kinds of circumstances. And then I also think that the story about really repressive states historically absolutely is a crapshoot. So my country, the Soviet Union, did not flourish in terms of the creative arts in the 20th century. Its literary tradition essentially collapsed. And there were a few remnants here and there. At the same time, other conditions generated great art production. Of course, it's also the case that it's easier to produce certain art under certain circumstances. What you're seeing with film in Russia right now is that there's a spectacular evasiveness of the war in it. Like it's a big part of Russian life, but suddenly films, which are claiming to be about Russian life, omitted, documentary films. So in good part, the answer is that what kinds of film movements arise is going to be a matter of what people do. And I'm somebody who believes that a lot of the causation for art production is internal. It's not the case that politics stimulates art production. It's usually art production that stimulates art production. And it's usually filmmaking that stimulates filmmaking. Of course, it's responsive to the political environment, but very often the stimulus is internal. So it's very, I mean, I work with a lot of creative people. It's very hard to speak in general terms about what our crisis means for creativity. We certainly also do have a lot of people who are really screwed up, right? This is not just navel gazing. We genuinely have worse mental health than previous humans. But the connection between bad mental health and creativity in art production is also not a great one. And it's very important that at the beginning of the 20th century, Freud said that when it comes to significant human artistic creativity, the place for neurosis gets evacuated. Right? That at least insofar as you're making good art, you're not neurotic. Even though our culture conceives of not just the truth, but Freud's own view in reverse to this. In fact, let me tell you exactly what Freud said. We forget too easily that we have no right to place neurosis in the foreground wherever a great accomplishment is involved. Freud, 12th of January 1910, Minutes of the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society. Let's see if we've got any super thanks to catch up on. Alex, it's not possible to answer your question on developing your talent in ADHD. I think you will already engaged about it. There's too much to say, except perhaps this generic remark that you always develop your talent with ADHD via leaning into the ADHD strengths rather than trying to compensate for the ADHD weaknesses. Most humans in this world today, not here in this room, are trying to compensate for their ADHD by trying to mitigate their weaknesses. Lean into the strengths as much as possible. Sanadel, any thoughts on romantic obsession overlapping with very close friendship? There is such a thing more present for heterosexual women than heterosexual men, which is that they develop a friendship that is almost like a romantic relationship in some ways, or has some of the features of it, especially if you think of it as a sort of a youthful romantic relationship. That's quite common, happens all the time, that a 45-year-old woman meets another 45-year-old woman, and they're like two 19-year-old giggly teenagers. Oh my God, had she texted me? And that can be very positive, actually, and pathological and lovely to play with. The trouble I'm having with your question is that the central distinction here is going to be a distinction about sexualization. And when an inappropriate and excessive intimacy, when there's certain kinds of intimacy and certain kinds of sexualization that are part of the romantic relationship, it's no longer a friendship. And therefore, friendship cannot take these kinds of blurs very well. And what do you mean by romantic obsession, as opposed to just feeling like you would like to convert your friendship into a romantic relationship? Maybe I'm missing something that you mean. And you say especially between gay men and straight men. I'll only say this. A lot of the relationships and friendships that we have in our culture are artifactual. They operate on a set of borrowed slogans, borrowed lines, borrowed behaviors, which keep being mutually reproduced by the two people involved and don't penetrate, sorry to use that word, properly into what the two people actually are like and then what it would be for them to sort of dance in the world together. So sorry, I won't take political questions today, but I'm sure I will take them on the next one. Pursuing a very competitive medical career in the USA as a foreigner, sometimes the path, not the destination, seems too overwhelming. Any advice for someone who has taken a very challenging path? Many thoughts, but I'll just share two. Obviously, you need as much of a support network if you are doing something difficult that recognizes that you're doing something difficult and can cheer you on, celebrate, and also see you when you're struggling as you try to do something difficult. Then think of what this training will allow you to have in your life and how you're going to use it in a way that fulfills you. What you don't want is a huge amount of medical training that makes you then professionally fulfilled, financially comfortable, but not generally fulfilled. Right? How do you connect this big hill you're climbing with a generally fulfilling life? Because the climbing the big hill isn't going to work out that well for you unless you make that connection. The difficulty of the hill itself is not a reason to climb it. So you've got to somehow connect that with the idea that you're going to be doing something in your life that is going to fulfill you to the point that at some point toward the end of your life, if you're lucky to live a long life, you're able to say, it would be okay now to go. Emma, Vlad, my mum says she'd like to be religious, but she's too cynical for it. Do you think religiosity is innate or can it be acquired? It's certainly not innate. Hi, beautiful Carter. Nice to see you. It's not innate. What would it mean if you are secular and suddenly you became religious in a healthy way? Could that even happen on my terms as a non-believer? Yeah, it could. It could. Where I depart is if you become a believer of something very niche that doesn't have great pedigree and great richness and great tradition. Vlad, I've converted. What have you converted? I've converted to the cult of Ricky, who lives in Tahiti. No, sorry. And what does Ricky think? Ricky thinks that everything is connected. No. You're not gonna become a Ricky cultist. But yeah, absolutely. You can become religious. What is that going to look like? It's going to, funnily enough, actually look, if it's healthy, like a process of very, very, very deep questioning. So it's going to be open-mindedness, contrary to your mum's intuition about how religious experience works, rather than closed-mindedness that gets you to become religious. Obviously, unless you are Russell Brand. But if you are the demographic that does this in a non-pathological way, it's going to be openness, not closeness, that gets you there. And that conversion is going to be not about, oh, I doubt and now I don't doubt. It's going to be, I doubt and now I doubt even more, and I question even more. Being religious non-pathologically doesn't mean, oh, I know what God is, I know what prayer is. You pray, man, I prayed, yeah. No, that's Russell Brand. If I'm religious healthily, I don't know what God is. I'm exploring, but I don't know what the connection between all the gods are. Is the Christian and the Islamic God the same God? Oh, yeah, actually, in many ways. Let's think more about that. What does it mean to be a purposive agent in the world? How come I am feeling some sense of kind of cosmic order, even though so much of it seems to have been sort of reflectively washed away from the world? What do I do when I pray? What is this? Right? I don't know what God is. I don't know what my relationship with God is. I'm on a journey. I'm exploring. That is constructive religious experience. I would say that as a secular person who certainly doesn't believe in a God, the space for healthy religious experience in our culture is underestimated. Sanadal is trying me again, and I might again fail because I might not be understanding the question. Hey, Vlad, I'm going to try again. What do you think it takes for unrequited love from one person to another to evolve into a healthy and close friendship? Look, practically, it normally means a break, right? If you have romantic feelings for somebody, it's going to be very difficult to organically convert that into a friendship. My recommendation, not every time, but most of the time, is going to be a break. How long of a break do humans need when they take a break from big stuff? 18 months is normally a very good period of time. At least 6 months to a year. And then you need to make sure that the relationship is boundaried. Boundaries are not this. Boundaries can have a pliancy, but they need to be there and they need to be based in true emotion. So, for instance, when they're in a relationship of their own, do you feel immensely happy for them? Or do you feel that could be me? That should be me. That person is with them, but it should be me. If you have that thought a lot of the time, you're not ready. Also, do you excessively sensualize and sexualize the relationship? And that can also mean very, very particular things, right? So with some close heterosexual female friends, as a heterosexual male, I'm capable of completely platonically holding their hand nonstop for 45 minutes while their husband is there. So it's not that you can reduce this to a set of behaviors. An exchange in the corridor of a sociology department can be a little, whereas a 4-hour one-on-one dinner together with wine can be perfectly appropriate and completely boundaried and healthy. So it depends. But I think that there needs to be some kind of transition. Hello, Vlad. How do you cope with guilt and shame? I found both paralyzing. That is from Homoud Mahadin. Guilt is a certain kind of self-directed aggression to do with the particular thing you've done to wrong somebody. Shame is feeling about the kind of person you've become in virtue of the thing, the kind of person that you are in virtue of the thing you've done. So with shame, you've got these sort of internalized eyes of the gaze of an imaginary other looking at the kind of person that you are, deleteriously speaking, in virtue of the thing you've done. I don't know what I can say simply without knowing more about you. Obviously, I have lots of generic answers like therapy, but it very much depends. Obviously, the only thing I would say is that there can be a distinction between certain kinds of shame and guilt, and people debate whether guilt can do this or not, but certain kinds of shame and guilt that are destructive and certain kinds of shame and guilt that are conducive to growth and reparative of yourself and of the object, of the wronged object. But I just feel I can't say anything without knowing more about you. So if you want to bombard me again with this, throw in more. I'm sorry, I really do wish that these comments, these chat things we're sharing could be longer. But I think they tend to cut off at a certain limit, which is tricky. So I'm going to think more about how I can answer questions like yours more constructively, because sometimes I just need a little bit more. Garrett, you said something about the elite universities producing lawyers who are lost because they aren't being educated in the ancient Greek sense. I mean, that was me speaking loosely. I might as well have said literally anything else. I might as well have said educated in the Heideggerian sense of being thrown into the world and then responding to the fact that here you are in the world, you control some things in it, you get to decide some things in it, other things you don't. They're just there. And so you go on and you orient yourself in that world. What courses like PPE at Oxford tend to produce, I'm not criticizing, it's a good course. I mean, for goodness sake, one of my heroes, Isaiah Berlin, was one of the first people to take that course in the early 1930s. And for some of it, he just had to read the papers. But there's that conveyor belt, for instance, from Oxford and Cambridge into finance, into law, in one's 20s, and then by one's 30s, one is lost. Often one's had kids, then one's been left by one's female partner because one's lost, one remains lost. Then one gets a younger girlfriend, and then one breaks up with the younger girlfriend because one's lost. And then one's 50, and one's very scared about being still lost. So that is common. That is a big common trajectory for the crisis of men. And here we're talking about a very privileged group of men who are wealthy, but like really scared and really lost. So what I meant by that is what kind of education in the broadest sense makes one well-adjusted with life, makes one well-adjusted at relating to death, makes one well-adjusted at not compartmentalizing one's career, right? A huge problem in our culture is the compartmentalization of careers. What do you do? Well, I do this and I do it really well and it's brilliant, but it's in a box. And when I come home from work, or if I stop working and I work from home and I stop working, the box is put away. And if you like, the Heideggerian or the Greek answer would be, no, all of life should be some kind of a box without necessarily fixed walls. an expanding box, and it shouldn't be a set of boxes that don't talk to one another. Right? It shouldn't be this kind of very toxic compartmentalization where you're really competent in one realm and spectacularly incompetent in another. And here I'm not talking about the previous conversation about intellectual capabilities. I'm talking about capabilities in the dimensions of life that are about being, secure, being happy and fulfilled. And that creates this very strange concept of privilege disadvantage. And there really is such a thing. You might think, well, screw that person. They're on £300,000 a year. Screw them with their disadvantage. But they're disadvantaged. They're lost. They're scared. They don't know how to live. Orion Anderson. I really want to make a big difference in the fight for Britain's democracy. I know it'd be excellent at political communication, as a political communication advisor, but I don't know how to start in that direction. Well, at the level of the cultivation of the virtues, what you have to cultivate is two virtues. One is understanding what people feel on the doorstep and how to translate that into political communication that actually engages with that properly. And the second is a capacity to engage in conflict constructively. A capacity to have a relationship that with conflict that always advances two things: the constructiveness of the conflict and your capacity to be victorious in it, which are related things. If you're very destructive in the way you engage with conflict in a democracy, you're not gonna do well, because your destructiveness will often be self-destructive. What should you actually do? It depends on your age. You sound young. Do word of mouth about whether you can do anything for anybody who is doing the sorts of work you want to do, including pouring coffee for them or just shuffling paper for them, if you're really young. Sorry if I'm missing you and you're much more advanced. And if you can't have that, then bombard people. And I'm a complete hypocrite advising you to do that, because I don't bombard anybody. I don't reach out to anybody about anything, which is a bad way, by the way. Don't learn from that. It's a bad way of me not leveraging the platform I have. But just bombard people, send 50 emails and get one yes about wanting to do something for somebody, having some work experience with somebody. So it's not going to come to you. You're going to be trying to engineer yourself into that position until a gap appears. And when the gap appears, you begin to push. And if you have that approach, your chances of getting in and you're good would be about 95%. Let's have a look at what else we've got. Ben, I am working on a nonfiction book about the Holocaust. Congratulations. Beyond being very careful about factual accuracy, what are the key ethical requirements for approaching this subject academically? Wow. You have to understand how the question of adequacy toward the Holocaust applies to the kind of enterprise you're engaged in. And that's an open-ended question, but it should be sort of hovering there for you. It should always be present somewhere a little bit above you. You've got to get things right, but you've got to have a deep and nuanced understanding of what it means to get things right, which depends on the kind of inflection your project has. Is your project about what the Holocaust means to us? Who is us? What are our needs? What are your responsibility to the us that has particular needs? Yeah. Then another remark I would say is that extraordinary space of non-closure when it comes to explaining why it all happened like it happened, right? It's very important that we have a set of very, very good explanations of very, very different kinds about why it happened. But it's very important to have a special sense of non-closure about it. That you genuinely wake up every week and there is that kind of I don't know space about what happened. Eek001, struggling with superego trap. How to move from daydreaming and procrastination to action, from desire to drive. Thank you. Therapy and taking action. Rather than daydreaming about the particular way you'd like to take a particular and impressive and ambitious action, take a small bit of action, and then another small bit of action, and then another small bit of action. Instead of emailing the perfect person you need to email in the perfect way, email somebody else you do quite need to email, but it's less of a big thing for you, and email them well, but more casually. So one has to be deeply engaged with your pathology and why you're stuck like this. And I'm not going to comment on that now. I can't in abstraction. I could say a few things, but it's going to be, the answer is going to be very particular to you. But the second thing, understand the self-perpetuating power of small actions that suddenly are going to make you feel less shit, less toxic about yourself when you've taken them. It's amazing how healing action conducive to growth is, even if it's tiny. Jordan, you also asked a question about democratic engagement for a person under 30. I feel I've kind of touched on that. Hurricane. I think we've got to think about how hard things are and how much harder they're going to get. What techniques can people use to maintain their spirits and keep trying to be functional? So there's really a chicken and an egg story here, and I often do one but not the other. I often talk about social forces that are generating various kinds of deformations, including psychological deformations. Obvious example is this, right? How the internet screws us up. But it's also possible to say the other way around, that we've got a heck of a lot of mental health issues. And by this, I mean only one of the two ways I could mean it. And I don't mean it the other way. I don't mean what I would call biologic mental health issues, which we have more of than before as well. These would be more in the realm of biological processes and indeed even chronic illness, right? So I don't want to talk about somebody who is depressed because their gut microbiome is screwed. That's not who I'm talking about. I'm genuinely talking about people who don't have a screwed up head because of stuff going on in their body. I'm talking about people who are genuinely sort of dislocated in the modern world, or can't fit in, or engage in all kinds of dodgy identity politics to evade reality, or engage in all kinds of dodgy sort of, you know, fascist-sized running away from facing their masculinity in the case of the crisis of men. That's what I'm talking about, right? So we've got just a lot of that. We're very, 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 very screwed up. And that is not relative to how hard things are. It's a product of social forces, sure, but it's not a product of how hard things are. There is a gap, right? Our world is overwhelming, that's true, and it's difficult, and it's uncertain, and I accept that there's grief and trauma when we deal with transformation, sure. But that's true, but it's also true that we have a level of psychological fragility that is not proportionate at all to our circumstances. We're freaking out way more than people during the Second World War. That's obvious. So it's both. And so in answer to how to freak out less in the sense of the disproportionate freak out, we're going to have to say different things than in answer to the question about the more proportionate kinds of freak out. So it is proportionate to just feel just like you can't bear to look at that Trump orange thing. It's not proportionate to not be able to function in your life at all because of the democratic crises we face. And even, I would say, I'm afraid, because of the climate crisis, which is the biggest challenge of the century. I'm a climate alarmist. But it's not proportional for your whole life to be in a cascading collapse because of the climate crisis. I don't buy that. I buy that there is climate anxiety. I actually buy that we're doing more to repress rather than to liberate out climate anxiety. I'm not one of these people who actually says climate anxiety has gone too far. In many ways, it's actually not gone far enough. But at the same time, we've got a lot of really, really screwed up people. So how do you balance all of that? It's a bit of a mess what I've said because my brain's beginning to melt down. So let's take two more questions after this one and we'll let ourselves go. So what you can't justify is a 45-year-old academic at the London School of Economics who does a dating profile, who says that he believes that what he is that he's polyamorous in these three particular ways, and that in bed he's like dominant, and that he's having panic attacks because of democratic decline, and that he lives with his mom and is physically well. We've got a problem here, right? That person needs therapy that moves them in a better direction. We've got a lot of that. So we've got to admit that there's a huge amount of freaking out about what's happening in the world that is not proportionate to the world we face. Our world is on average way better than the world most humans have faced. As our world gets worse, which it is going to get worse over the next couple of decades, it'll still be better than the vast majority of worlds humans faced. And there's certain kinds of unbelievable meltdown about it that are not proportionate. They're a reflection of our mental health crisis and pathology crisis. On the other hand, I do think there's a lot of proportionate reaction that's out there that's completely reasonable. I try to mostly speak to that. I do think it's okay to be scared if you're expectations from the recent historical past are offset. I do think it's understandable to be scared when you don't have a sense of the future. It's understandable. I do think it's understandable to be scared. And we are a culture without a sense of the future. It's not our fault, individually. I do think it's okay to be sometimes, to indeed be up at night worrying about the climate crisis. Sometimes that's okay. So I want to be very open and very compassionate to all of that, but I also want to say that as well as that, we have this really freaky level of fragility. What are the solutions to it? Well, in the freaky fragility case, we've got to actually do individual journeys of self-development, work on our mental health and so on. In terms of the other thing, the more sort of proportionate dance with the world, when the world's overwhelming us, it's throwing things that are really difficult to cope with, there we can, first of all, just accept that there's going to have to be a period of grief for a lot of people about the fact that the world can't be something they wanted it to be, about that blueprint mismatch. That often will take 1 year to 2 years of grief. I think that grief has a collective quality because I actually think that we're kind of going through it as a culture at the same time. So I do think that by the 2030s, people are going to be mostly through this period of grief. The other thing I would say is, of course, we have to lean on the hope and resilience of humans who have lived through worse things than what we're living through. The third thing we need, of course, is community. We need people who see us. We need people with whom we can engage constructively about politics. So community is incredibly important when your politics is trending in a negative direction. The ability to engage deeply with the world around you, with people you care about, people you love, people you regularly interact with in a physical way, not just online. That's really, really important. It's also important, of course, to teach ourselves to negotiate the information environment much more constructively. The information environment is so toxic that it's genuinely hard for most well-adjusted people to negotiate it constructively. And also that's something I appreciate. So I hope you tolerate this kind of slightly conflictive ramble that I've given. But I do both think that there's a lot of stuff falling apart that's genuinely, understandably intimidating for most people. But at the same time, I also think that we're screwed up in all kinds of ways, in a way that is historically disproportionate. I'm going to take 2 more questions. Rachel, you're going to call your dad. I'm going to call my dad briefly after this, and then I'm going to crash. Do you ever get your time and attention taken over by doom scrolling? What techniques can you use to break the cycle? So I have a very intentional relationship with trash. I consume trash intentionally. I rarely consume trash in this kind of scroll kind of way. I often say, am I in the kind of state of mind to consume trash? And if I am, which happens maybe once a month, then I consume trash. So for instance, yesterday I was in my wheelchair too long, and suddenly something happened, and I entered a complete cascade of some kind of microvascular cardio crisis. I needed to be on oxygen. I was feeling like I might even need to go to hospital for about 10 hours, which is a catastrophic thing because it'd be life-threatening for me to go to hospital. And as I began to stabilize from that disastrous state, which was new, which is always very difficult with acute chronic illness, because you can always deal with a really bad version of something you're familiar with. And so as I was dealing with this, I said, wow, I am going to consume some trash now. And my trash in the last few years is probably apocalyptic trash. So I found a Belgian series about a world when the sun became deadly and people had to either be underground or permanently move away from the sun by flying across the planet. And it's a series. And I was well enough to watch something, but not well enough to do anything else. So I started watching that. But that was very intentional. So I put in high quality headphones. I had it on a big wide screen. It wasn't just something, oh, I don't really want to do that. So I did it very intentionally. So I do recommend sometimes consuming light stuff, trashy stuff intentionally. So that's how I avoid the doom scroll. The other way I avoid the doom scroll is that I sometimes scroll, but I scroll often with professional attitude. I scroll by thinking, oh, what is going on social media? How does this platform work? Can I learn something from this? So I often don't feel toxic about social media because for me, it's a little bit of a professional thing to consume it because I'm on it and I think about it. So it's almost like something you do with a pair of gloves and goggles, and therefore it doesn't feel toxic. It doesn't feel sort of comes into you like that. So that's the beginning of an answer. Bonnie in Brighton, thank you so much. Imagination, love, thank you so much. Let's try to find one last question and then we'll rock and roll ourselves to calling it a day. The yes of a kid. Hey, Vlad, I've got a question I've been wanting to ask you for 2 weeks. Should I pursue my passion and go to a high-ranking college I was accepted to, or pursue a stable job first, or pursue a stable job instead? It's very personal. And here I'm not going to put you off from listening to somebody like Gary Vaynerchuk on this. But you have to balance Gary Vaynerchuk and obviously understand his extreme ADHD and the Heideggerian thrownness into the world. Because what was I describing with this Heideggerian thrownness? I was describing essentially what a liberal education looks like. It's an education that is supposedly gonna make you negotiate the world better. So are you gonna stack yourself with $400,000 worth of debt, or $150,000, $210,000 worth of debt? Is going to be clearly a factor here. Beyond that, it's going to be a personal decision. It can be absolutely right to go both ways, and therefore it's just impossible for me to give you the answer. I think what you have to do is make sure you haven't underestimated the value of that education beyond the leg up in the marketplace it might give you, as something that could create networks for you, right? Great way of meeting people, bonding for life. It's going to create a very magical experience, probably, that you'll never forget. It's going to maybe give you a bit of that quality of liberal education, making you well adjusted to being in the world. On the one hand. On the other hand, can you absolutely flourish without a single university degree? God, yeah. Is it a bit easier to do that today than 20 years ago? Yes. But all of these are generalizations that we can't just sellotape onto you because you're an individual. I also think that sometimes in life, there are 50-50 decisions and you just have to make a call. So it's not necessarily the case that there is going to be an answer here. There might be, there absolutely might be, but it's not necessarily the case that there's been an answer here that is so clear that you're going to be an idiot not to take it. Moreover, it's also possible that which is the right answer might be a matter of the luck that you have having chosen that path. And so how lucky you get on each path might then settle, which path was the right path to take. We're going to call it a night, beautiful community. Thank you for tolerating me. And I'm going to catch you later. Catch you later, beautiful community.